I'm Catherine Kingsley.
And I'm Catherine Stern.
And this is
Contemplating Culture,
a missionary walk through a secular age. Together we journey through A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, a book looking at the history and philosophy of how the world got where it is, and the impacts of our contemporary culture for us today as missionaries.
And we're inviting you to join the conversation.
Hi there, and welcome to Contemplating Culture.
Hello, everyone.
So this week we are still within the chapter of providential deism. So we're looking again further at the situations within that shift in practical living where maybe God exists, but he doesn't need to intervene and doesn't intervene in my kind of daily life. And in this little section, Charles Taylor reminds us of the main factor here being the fourfold anthropocentric shift.
Okay, so if you remember a few podcasts back, and it's fair enough if you don't, I had to go back and reread what we talked about. We talked about the four eclipses. So the eclipse of further purpose, that idea of that we're not focused on the next life anymore, that our job is to flourish in the here and now, to work out what it is that God has made us for and to live on this earth the life that he's made us to live. And that then leads into the shift, the eclipse of grace, that idea that, well, if we have everything that we need, that if the point of our life is human flourishing now, then there's no need for God to give us anything extra, no need for interventions because he's already given us everything that we need to live this life, that he's really sort of there to create us and then to judge what we did at the end with what he's already given us. The third eclipse then, if you remember, is the eclipse of mystery, that if it's all here and now, if God's given us everything that we need, if God's really just there as creator and judge, then those things like evil and miracles are really not necessary. And actually, more than not necessary, they don't make sense in this picture. And the final eclipse then is the eclipse of transcendence, with purpose being human flourishing here and now, holiness and the working towards an eternal living forever with God is reduced really to moral conduct and living well now, that any kind of pointing further into something bigger is not necessary and not helpful.
That's a good summary. And like you said, it's good to keep just rehashing these over and over again because it's not like it's something that happened and has no impact now. It actually has a huge impact now. So it's good to keep thinking because they're still kind of playing out today and there's still tension, you know. It's not like they're totally gone. There's still a tension, I guess, in us and in the world around us.
Absolutely. It's like we live with a world where all of these things are sitting in that place of eclipse, really.
Yeah. And so Charles Taylor says that, you know, like once this further purpose is gone, well, we don't need the same level of resources. And grace was a resource to help us reach that further purpose, to save us from ourselves and all of those things for that higher purpose. So what happens here is he says there's a humanist replacement for grace. So grace involves something transcendent, something outside of this little closed frame of us living our lives here. And there's a humanist replacement, which he calls benevolence and universal justice. So effectively like goodness and justice that extends beyond just my direct connections or people that I'm connected with, but everyone. I'm now connected, you know, have this sense I'm connected to everyone and justice is owed to everyone.
Which is kind of interesting because if you remember in the last podcast, KK does remember, but I'm reminding you, in the last podcast we were talking about the idea of tolerance and polite society. It's like once we get rid of a higher purpose, and once we're looking only at human flourishing here and now, we take this layer off, and what we're looking at in today's podcast, what we looked at in the last podcast, benevolence, tolerance, politeness, justice. These are like sort of the next level down once you take away grace and those higher, what would you call it, virtues really.
That's good. I actually didn't remember. You were the one that made the connection. You're like, no, last time we talked about tolerance and that was like another humanist replacement. And I was like, it's so true. And I think that we're going to see that, that as we start to lose the sense of the transcendent, as we're living in the immanent frame, we're just going to see it time and time again, that these higher ideals, virtues, values, whatever they are, that they're going to be finding humanist replacements. So this is like a new humanist kind of movement, but it's not the first humanist movement. So Taylor wants to remind us that there was ancient humanists, but he says this is different from that line of thought in two major ways. So he says the first is that it has an activist, interventionist stance to both creation and human society. This sense that we can and we should reorder ourselves, our society, our creation to suit human purposes. And also it presupposes the good of all, that we're acting for the good of all.
So if you are wondering what the difference between that and the ancient humanists is, we did a little bit of research, reminded ourselves, and really the best way to sum it up would be that the ancient humanists were held back by the limits of what is, really, that their approach to the world was very much one of, flourishing with what is, reason within what is. So like the best example I can come up with on the spot would be that if I am eating so much that my stomach is starting to get really painful, then the ancients would have said, well, stop eating. Whereas the moderns are like, how can I fix my stomach so that I can eat as much as I want and not suffer?
That's it. The ancient idea was this, that's the whole time where they had this idea of form, I guess, of things are how they are, and you interact with things how they are, and you find your good within that. And what you're saying is that then they would move within those limits, whereas now there's this new humanist stance has I can and I should do something because my desire is the greatest good here, and I can rework everything to suit my purpose.
Absolutely.
And so from this, I guess we start to look at then, well, if goodness and universal justice are the things that we're working from, where does the power for this come from? And Taylor says it lands in something akin to measured sympathy, that you don't want to be too radical. I remember a few episodes ago we talked about, dangerous religion. It's that kind of sense. If you want to stay in the realm of what's safe, and because it's universal, you do have care for your other human beings, but it lands on the level of sympathy. And he would say that this, humanity discovered that this capacity for measured sympathy resides in all of us. So he says they could find within their own human resources the motivation to universal beneficence and justice. And that this is what he would call a successor to agape. So the example he gives is the Good Samaritan. So we see in the story of the Good Samaritan, the priest went by, the Levite went by, and it was the Samaritan, the person from the other town, who helps out the person who is hit by brigands on the side of the road. And so in the original telling of this story, when Jesus is telling this story, it's meant to be a radical thing that the Samaritan would intervene. And it's based on this sense of what is real love. I'm meant to love my neighbor. What is real love? And he's saying, well, your neighbor is everyone, not just those that you have a natural connection to, a natural solidarity with. Whereas this humanist movement, I guess, would almost reread this story as though, well, of course, because we've inherited this idea over time, it's developed that actually now we're just acting out of universal justice and our capacity for goodness. So maybe this is, maybe they're leaving the lots of money to look after this guy. Maybe that was on the heroic end. Maybe it's just human altruism, but it definitely doesn't have any reference to love in there.
I guess where I would want to enter into it is somewhere around like only God is good. God is the source of goodness, whether people recognize it or not. The guy who comes to Jesus and says, "Good master, what must I do to achieve eternal life?" And Jesus turns on him and says, "Why do you call me good? God alone is good." Because I think that is really the layer that has been removed. If you forget that bit, that the source of this goodness, the source of agape love is actually, like, we can't love like that without grace, without God. That's the bit that's been sliced off, if you like. No, well, actually we are good, and it's natural in us as human beings to love one another like that.
And that's exactly the story that we're going to be talking about today, of how moral power doesn't come from God anymore, because we're now in this immanent frame. So our moral power has to be immanent. It has to be humanist. It has to come from what's already within, which is us. We're the, pinnacle thing there. So then we start to look at, it's kind of flipping on its head, this period of time, what human desire is. So a lot of the Christian preaching at this time would have been around sin and stuff like that. And you need God's grace to save you from sin. So if you're removing those layers, well, then suddenly there's this idea that maybe your human desire was good all along, or maybe it wasn't bad. So that's the kind of two lines of thought that take off in this period. So the first one is that human desire is innocent, neutral, and it has the capacity to be formed. And actually, so it can be good when it's guided by reason and discipline. And the second one is that human desire is good, that at the base of our humanity is goodness, and it might have been covered over, and we might have had ritual and tradition that had told us to the contrary, and we've had to rediscover that deep in our nature there's goodness. And so what emerges is this sense of, if you've got enough reason and discipline, you'll be able to discover the goodness that's within you. So I've got another quote here from him. He says, "The disengaged, disciplined agent, capable of remaking the self, who has discovered and thus released in himself the awesome power of control, is obviously one of the crucial supports of modern exclusive humanism." So this disciplined, disengaged agent is able to be an agent of good in the world, totally distant and separated from God. And I guess one of the real points that Taylor is trying to make through the whole book, and it comes up again, and it's probably a discussion for another time, but it's good to keep remembering that this is why he's telling us the story, is he's saying where we land on the capacity for human goodness, separate from God, is not a natural thing. And that's what he would call the subtraction story. So the subtraction theorist would say that once we got rid of everything that was holding us back, we landed on this natural goodness. I've got another quote from him. He says, "The core of the subtraction story consists in this, that we only need to get these perverse and illusory condemnations off our back, and the value of ordinary human desire shines out in its true nature, as it has always been." But he says, like all striking human achievements, there is something in it which resists reduction to these enabling conditions. And so he says, we're actually not as in awe of this achievement to have goodness without God as we should be. And I guess for me, going on this journey has helped me understand something of why we do good for the people that don't have God. So, as I've said before, I've got 4 brothers, and not all of those are following the line of Christianity in a practical way, but they're inheritance of this Western story. And I see it in the world as well. Like I've got some friends in social work, and they would say that a lot of the social work field is full of atheists. And it's so fascinating to me that there's this power for goodness. My brothers, very, very good people, but it's not their love of God that's inspiring them. Social workers doing really good work, but it's not their love of God that's inspiring them. And so I've had this questioning in me for a long time of, where does our power for good come from? I mean, I don't know, because I've never lived any part of my life without knowing God. But I don't know, like, if I didn't have God, would I still be inclined towards good? Or would, once God's gone, do I just do whatever I want kind of thing? It's this fascinating kind of question. So I guess I wanted to have a bit of a discussion around this idea of goodness and how we see it play out, and I guess as missionaries, how we enter into this space.
Okay, well, one thing that's sitting in my head when I think about goodness really is that goodness is one of what we might call the transcendentals. I'm trying to think of a nice, simple way of describing what the transcendentals are. I think like it sits alongside beauty and truth, and then there's some argument about what else there might be, things like unity, for instance. But they're attributes, if you like, of God that we all share.
Mm-hmm.
And to the extent that we have them, but also can see them, they point us back to God.
Yeah.
Is that would that fit with your understanding?
Yeah. I see them as attributes of God that He's put in us to point us back to Him.
So I guess what I'm thinking is if goodness is one of those, it's probably the most maligned one of those. Like, I don't know about you, but, you know, names like goody two-shoes or this idea of Christians as, I'm putting up fingers here to quotation marks, good people. Like there's something about goodness that doesn't in some ways feel like it's valued on that level. And maybe it's because we've discovered a humanist level of goodness that doesn't point us beyond.
Even just thinking about, is it the Hippocratic Oath that's do good and avoid evil? You can have this question of even in the places where goodness is seen as a good thing, it very much stays within the immanent. I'm sure there's many atheistic doctors and nurses who are working towards good, but with no reference to anything higher. And so if we're looking at it, I guess, from a missionary stance, we were talking about this as we were kind of looking at where we wanted to go with this episode. And, well, how do you bring in, you know, God in this place where people are perfectly happy to have goodness without anything higher? And it's almost like it's so strange that this transcendental, this thing that's meant to point us to the transcendent, has been so drawn down to the level of the immanent, that we can have it, but it's no reference to anything higher, that it's kind of doesn't have the same power to convert, I guess, that it once might have, just in, as you were saying, the different ways that we might relate to it. Like Saints Damien and Cosmos in the very early church were two brothers, and they converted people through their goodness. They were doctors, but or medical, or whatever you would call them back then, and they were treating people free of charge, and that's how they were converting people to Christianity. But I feel like now, if you were treating someone free of charge, well, that's just the healthcare system in a lot of ways. Do you know what I mean? Like, goodness doesn't have the same power to convert of its own, and I think that that's fascinating.
Yeah, or it does and it doesn't. It's not universal. Like, I can think of moments in my life where someone else's goodness has made me stop and think.
Yeah.
And amend my own behavior. And maybe because I am Christian, goodness points me very naturally towards God. But it's not, as you say, it's not a universal thing. And a lot of people's goodness I just take for granted because that's what we do, isn't it?
Yeah, we expect it.
And we form it. I was thinking about, we teach little kids, can you remember learning to share?
Yeah.
And the excruciating...
Four brothers, I definitely had to learn to share.
That excruciating experience.
Why do I have to share? Why can't they share?
Yeah. But the excruciating experience of self-denial. And there's something, we just expect parents to teach their children those kind of pieces of goodness.
If a child isn't sharing, you're thinking, what kind of poor parenting have they had?
Yeah. Yeah. And yet we're forming in them a capacity for self-denial, for a love that lays itself down for another. There's something actually far greater than just ordinary good parenting that is being formed in that child, whether the parent realizes it or not. That even that basic goodness of a child sharing its toys is pointing them.
And I guess when we were beginning our discussion, I think I was saying, I think even just helping people to question why they do good is a beginning point. But then you're saying, but it's not enough. Like, it's not enough to have conversations around goodness and why do we do good. And actually we're teaching kids to share because it's going to help them be in society kind of thing. Like, that we could probably reason out a lot of, because that's the goodness we've inherited. We've inherited a reasoned out goodness. And so you could begin there. And then I guess for me, I would go on to talk about, well, I am not good on a reasonable basis. My goodness comes from the transcendental, the thing that I can't make sense of, the love that's been given to me. But you had some really interesting insights of, I guess, even at a ground level, how we can kind of use goodness and look at how goodness is in the world to take people higher.
Yeah, well, I was thinking, we make movies and people watch them and rewatch them, and we show them, particularly in schools, if you noticed, movies about goodness, like the ordinary person whose selflessness, heroic goodness changes other people's lives. And we show them to teenagers in particular to sort of form them. But we also watch them for our own entertainment. And I don't think it's because it's fun. It's because it touches something in us.
Yeah. One of our sisters was saying just the other day that it doesn't matter for a Christian movie. They're not all A grade movies. Some of them are B grade or C grade or even D grade. But it doesn't matter, because even if she, like on an enjoyment level, it's not the same cinematic quality. Something about those transcendentals in her is being hit, which is like feels lifted up just because of the truth, beauty and goodness that's kind of being evoked in her. It's that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And so I think there's something about drawing our attention to goodness that points us maybe not up for people who don't have God in their lives, whose lives don't revolve around God. It points me up, but it points maybe into a longing that might one day help them find God, if that makes sense. That there's this longing for, there's this response in us as human beings to heroic acts of goodness. So that watching a movie like Hacksaw Ridge, for instance, there's this response in us that I think is innate in us because we've got the transcendentals in us, because we're meant to be pointed back to God. And I was thinking, there's a story that's told about Pope John the 23rd. Someone was asking him about ecumenism. And I don't remember the story well, so forgive me if you do. But he said something like, well, look, wherever I find a wall between Christians, I like to just knock out a brick or two. And I was thinking, well, maybe that's one of the kind of basic evangelization calls that's upon our lives in this space. That, like, I can't necessarily make you see that the goodness that in you is actually coming from the fact that you're made in the likeness of God who is good. But maybe I can knock a brick out of the ceiling that is holding you in this, what Taylor would call immanent frame, so that you can see up through that hole to something bigger, and the light from the something bigger can shine down on you. And maybe just by watching a movie like that with you and having a conversation about heroic goodness stirs something that might help you move closer to seeking out God as the source of all goodness. It's
good. I love that image. And I love even it's already expanded my image. I think when I think of the immanent frame, I think of it, with this roof on top. But I'm now like, oh, it's also got walls around it, and you can knock out, that I think if, as you said, for everyone, it might not be going up, but even if we can expand how wide they go to see that, whoa, there's maybe not limits on the side either. I think there's something in that. It's such a helpful image. And I guess there's different ways that you can do this. Like knocking out a brick for someone might just be the heroic goodness. And really what you're talking about is not just goodness, but elevating that to greatness, right?
Mm-hmm.
That if you in your life have the capacity to step out in a great way, in love, that's going to plant some kind of seed that might help wear down some of the mortar holding people in this closed space, or it might be pointing people to the lives of the saints or some of these. It might be in the arts, in these stories of heroic people, real or fictional, that there's, I think, a lot of tools that we can use to start to, wear down the mortar or knock out bricks in these closed ideas that separate us from the higher ideals.
And some of it might just be about living a life of ordinary goodness and integrity. My most recent homily that had a little conversion in me was a priest who was sharing his story of before he had gone off to study for the priesthood. And he was talking, he had his ideal job and he really liked working for this company. But over the years, he really got caught in that whole company culture of competitiveness and talking about people behind their backs and knocking people down and that kind of thing. And when he started getting more into his faith, he started seeing this, and little by little, with the grace of God, he started turning around those trends in his own life and, learning to only speak well of other people at work and not, fighting to get himself ahead and that sort of thing. And he said by the time he handed his resignation to his boss and told him that he was going off to study for the priesthood, his boss said he wasn't surprised. And it wasn't because of any kind of putting out there, I'm Catholic and, I take my faith very seriously, but the little by little changes in his goodness, if you like, in the workplace didn't go unnoticed by the people around him at work. I think that's a knocking a brick out.
Yeah, that it doesn't have to be a sledgehammer, a sledgehammer moment, that it can be just the slow eroding work of goodness. Well, maybe that's a good place for us to end today, of just, I guess, leaving you those two tools of, in whatever missionary evangelization field you're in, of just looking at how can I be just opening up a space over time for someone to consider something more and to be inspired by something more. Like, as you said, as human beings, we're naturally disposed to being inspired when we see these things. So I guess that, and then for ourselves as well, just reflecting on why do we do good and how can we allow ourselves to be inspired as well to that higher greatness.
Amen.
This has been Contemplating Culture, a podcast produced by the Missionaries of God's Love Sisters. For more information from today's episode, be sure to check out the show notes. We pray that today has blessed you, and most importantly, we invite you to continue the conversation.